The following program is produced by Londonderry residents. The views and opinions expressed are not necessarily the views and opinions of the LACTV staff or its volunteers, and should not be considered an endorsement by CTV 20 or its staff and volunteers.
Welcome, Londonderry, to another edition of Concord Conversations, where we talk about local, county, and state goings-on in the State House and around municipalities. I'm Doug Thomas, representative here in Londonderry, Vice Chair of Science, Technology, Energy, and with me is Representative Wayne McDonald, the Chair of Health and Human Services and Elderly Affairs.
Good morning.
Today, we're going to deviate slightly from what we normally do and step back a little bit and talk a little bit about what we do as state representatives, how we get some bills through, give maybe a few examples of what we go through. It's not a job that you go up there one day a week for a few hours, vote and come back and spend the rest of your day at home. There are a lot of things that we do as state reps if you want to get involved. And a lot of them involved with, of course, constituent services, as well as county affairs and the state affairs. So with that being said, I'm going to open it up with talking to Wayne here. Wayne, give us a little summary about starting from the first day of the first biennium, how we prepare for the season and what we go through in general throughout the rest of the year.
Well, for a new legislator, when we're, both Doug and I have had the privilege of serving previous to this, but for a brand new legislator, there's the filing period by the middle of June. I forget the exact date at this point, but there's the filing period for the state primary in June. If you make it through the primary in September, then you continue on through November's election. And shortly after the November election, I happen to bring the state, we have on a regular basis, we get the what we call the state calendar, the House calendar. Senate has its own version. Senate is in yellow for some reason, but it has a lot of the deadlines in it. And after you get elected, should you be fortunate enough to get elected, and I think I speak for Doug, myself, and hopefully our entire local delegation, and maybe even the entire House, when I say it's a great honor to have been to have the privilege to serve. But the first day for all representatives to file LSRs, meaning legislative service requests, which are the beginnings of what they hope will be a successful bill and become law. The first day of that is November 6th, right after the November 5th election. So we hit the ground running if you get elected. What you do is you file those with the Office of Legislative Services. You give as much information as possible so that they know what you want to do, and then they start researching it, putting in a legalese, so to speak, and subsequently you have to sign off on it by a date certain. You're encouraged during legislative orientation to speak to departments involved and other stakeholders so that the legislation not only is going to be as effective as possible, but also have as much support as possible. It's a very detailed and extensive process to work its way through the various committees. Some legislation, depending on its nature, goes to more than one committee in the House and then gets voted on by the full body. Then it has, of course, got to go to the Senate and go through a similar process. And many bills, most bills, don't make it. So it's the more homework you do in this process, the better. There are 21 committees in the House, I believe, Doug?
Right now, yes.
And as Doug indicated, he's on Science, Technology, and Energy. I'm on Health and Human Services and Elderly Affairs. They're both, those are a couple of the busier committees, and the legislation that comes before them can be very involved. We have some rather long hearings in my committee, or the committee I'm privileged to serve on. We deal with things like medication, vaccines, various surgical procedures, system redesign. As the name would indicate, it's the Health and Human Services and Elderly Affairs Committee. So we primarily deal with legislation relating to health and human services. It's the largest department in state government. It represents 1/3 of the state workforce, half of the state budget, and it's, as you can imagine, it's a lot of, the bills are not always easy. We've dealt with gender reassignment surgery. That particular hearing went through we had to have it in the House chamber. Every single bill that goes in front of the House has to have a hearing, a public hearing, and it has to be noticed in the calendar, in this calendar, which is also available on the website. And everybody is entitled to speak. In our committee, we have to set time limits only because we want to make sure everybody has a fair chance to be heard. And usually there's a lot of questions from committee members, and they can be very detailed. Our committee has several medical professionals on it, which is really helpful. And the more, I don't know if the word controversial applies, but the more concerning the bill is, the more likely it is going to be a large turnout. And we've had some of the larger committee rooms for some of the bills, but gender reassignment bills, for example, and I know that's an important issue to everyone, whether you're for it or against it, affected by it or not directly. That's been a very important and hot topic, and we had that one in the House chamber, which is designed to seat 400 people. That lasted all day, along with, we had 2 bills to that effect, and that lasted all day from I think we started at either 9 or 10 a.m. and we went until 4 o'clock. We had over 100 people sign up to testify, and most of them did so. Some of them had to leave before we were able to have them come forward. But it's a very detailed process. Medicaid expansion was another hot topic. The whole notion of related to Obamacare and so forth. Medicaid expansion was another very hot topic. We didn't have to have that in the House chamber, but it did last 2.5 hours, and we ended up extending Medicaid for another 7 years, so till the turn of the next decade, beginning of the next decade. So those are some of the things we deal with in my committee. And of course, Doug, your committee is net metering and energy challenges, and of course, as different energy costs go up, I'm sure that's something you have to deal with too. And
right, we deal a lot with renewable energy policies that can affect your electricity bill. But I'd like to go back a little bit, talk a little bit about the beginning process. Many times Wayne and I have seen this. Someone that just gets elected, they feel like they can go in there and they can immediately make a change, or maybe they're a 1-agenda candidate, possibly a 2-agenda candidate, and they go in there and they say, we're going to fix this. We're going to make sure this doesn't happen again. And so they file their LSR with the people at OLS, and oftentimes a lot of people file it, they think it's going to come back perfect, and they think they don't have any more work to do. And we have found out that's just not the case. So OLS is a staff of lawyers, and they try and put things in legal terms, trying to figure out to put your idea into what would be a bill. Oftentimes they don't quite get there, and you're surprised. What comes out is not exactly what you were expecting. If you're not keeping your eye on the ball, you can have a process where a bill gets published to go to a committee, not really the wording that you wanted. And then you run into issues with, do you have to do amendments or make changes and so forth. The other issue we have with LSRs is most people will file them, and the only thing that comes out on our website is the title of the LSR, which can be misleading at times. Even though there might be a key word in there, it may not be what you think it is. Well, you may want to sign up to support that as a co-sponsor, but you don't have a chance to read it. Unless the person who initially submitted the LSR, unless that person has opened it up for everybody to see, and that's not usually the case, or unless you call the prime sponsor up and talk to that person directly, you may be co-sponsoring a bill that turns out is not what you thought it was, and you may have to either backtrack or take your name off it later on before it's too late. So that's a process that you have to keep your eye on the ball. That's more time consuming and something that you have to figure out when you're first going up there. Once the bill actually reaches its final format, it gets sent, and bills are assigned to committees by the Speaker of the House. And oftentimes, you know, they don't have a bevy of staff members up there that goes through every single bill with a complete knowledge of what that bill is about. They do read every single bill, and based on what they read on the bill, they make a determination which committee can best handle it, and then they assign it. And that's, and the first time that we as committee chairs and vice chairs see that bill is when it comes out of the clerk's office and actually gets assigned to our committee. That's when we know we have it in our committee, and that's when we can read it and find out what the bill is all about. So there's a long process before the bill even gets to our committee, before we can even schedule a public hearing.
Right.
And scheduling the public hearing can be a challenge because sometimes you think this bill is maybe simple, and so you schedule 15 minutes to a half an hour before the next bill, and you're surprised. Maybe you get 20 people come in and want to speak the bill. The next thing you know, you're there for a good hour and you're way over schedule. Or sometimes you think a bill is going to take you an hour or and a half because you think it's going to require a lot of public hearings and a lot of controversy, and you find out you sail right through it, and maybe you're done in 15, 20 minutes with all of the public hearing. And because of this, because you allowed more schedule, now you have to wait maybe a half hour before the next bill comes up, because you cannot start a public hearing prior to the time and date that it was introduced in the calendar. You just don't do that. So it's a challenge to figure out just how long it might take, and sometimes you hit it and sometimes you don't. I know, and not every bill you think is simple. Some of the most simplest bills you would think wouldn't be a problem. I'll give you an example. A couple of years ago, I thought it was a good idea on your electricity bill, if people actually look at them, it tells you how much money you spend for what item. But oftentimes there are categories on there that are bundled, and so you don't really know every little facet of what was charged on your bill. But there's one item involving the RPS program, Renewable Portfolio Standard Program, which is basically a surcharge on energy based on fossil fuel use and carbon emissions and so forth. Anyway, it is bundled into another category. You have no idea that you're even paying for it. So I thought it would be a good idea just to put on the bill just how much money per month you're spending on that particular program. That is a state program, not a federal program. And I thought, what could be easier just to put that on there? Well, the first time I tried to get it through, it went through the House, and it got to the Senate, and it just hit a brick wall. They had a problem with dollar figures on there, and so the Senate decided that instead of having dollar figures on the bill, instead they would put the cents per kilowatt hour for that program on the bill, and that it would appear only once a year at the end, which is a accumulation. Well, we took it because it was better than having nothing. It got our foot in the door, but it really was a useless piece of data, because who's going to figure out cents per kilowatt hour, adding up your annual kilowatt hours to find out how much you really paid for that. So following year, I thought we would do something a little different. I went back and I resubmitted the bill to change the cents per kilowatt hour to some dollar figure. And we thought that was going to be simple as well. And it was a little easier, but not really. There was some pushback. There were some concerns about what it might cost utility companies to change their software program. But in the end, we did come out with at least an average figure on your electric bill, which shows up every December. And now you can see what you spend on that program, the RPS program. You can see what you spend on an annual basis on an average. It's an average figure. It won't be exact because of the way the program works, but it took 2 terms to get that little thing on your bill. So it's not always cut and dried and easy as some people might think it is. So Wayne, have you any experience with getting a bill through that you thought was simple and wasn't?
Well, a good example in bringing the Senate into the mix, and of course the Senate is an important partnership. You know, it's an important partnership. That's the way our system of government is designed, and they're an integral part of the process. We had this bill, HB 1303 FN. It was an early bill. It had to go to the Ways and Means Committee after it came to us. This individual, I believe he's from Manchester. He left his entire estate, which was a relatively modest estate, to New Hampshire, and he wanted it earmarked for refugee resettlement purposes. And it ended up going to a subcommittee. We thought it was going to be a quick and easy hearing. I think we allowed 15 minutes for it. It went the better part of an hour. To Doug's point, it's hard to forecast how long it's going to take. And again, people who show up and have concerns, as long as they're legitimate and they want to speak, they're given that opportunity. It's important for them to be able to do so. So we had the hearing. It became so complex an issue because there's no specific fund for that, and the Department of Health and Human Services expressed concern. Well, we certainly aren't against it. Sometimes they take a positive position, sometimes they oppose a bill, and in many cases they don't take a position, but they do express concern, and they testify on almost every bill. And so we don't really have a fund dedicated to that. So we ended up having a subcommittee. Myself, the ranking member of the committee, and a couple of others came up with these 3 different places for the estate to be divided equally. The Senate just sent it back to us with an amendment saying instead of a third, a third, and a third, they want 40% for one, 40% for another, and 20% for the other. And I've talked to Chairman Janigian of the Ways and Means Committee, and we're going to be discussing this in our committee because we were the first committee on Wednesday, and decide whether, what we're going to do with it. We're at the point where most of the hearings on bills have occurred at this point. Most of the executive sessions have been held in terms of voting the bill out of committee and making a recommendation to the full House. And that's coming up. That has to be done this week, and then next week it'll be resolved by the full House of Representatives. We're in the process now of deciding whether we're going to concur with Senate action, and they're not done with all of our bills yet. But we're in the process, all of our committees are, of deciding whether we're going to concur with Senate action, which means we accept the changes they made and we're going to vote on it. We're ready to send it to the floor of the House, whether we're going to not concur and recommend the House just kill it, or we're going to not concur but ask for a committee of conference where members of both bodies will get together and try to work out any differences. And so far I've gotten 2 of the bills back. Our committee has received 2 bills back. I don't know if you've received any bills back from.
We have, yes.
And that's going to be in the process. And again, just to give you a little bit of a time frame, Thursday, May 30th is the last day to form committees of conference. June 6th is the last day to sign off committee of conference reports. The session is winding down. June 13th is when the House and the Senate will be done for the summer. Then we'll have to come back in the fall, what we call veto day. Invariably, the governor disagrees with both chambers and will veto legislation. And we have to come back under the Constitution for that sometime this fall. But anyway, I don't want to.
And that's just an example of some of the time that we spent. And to a lesser degree, but still important, just because if you're assigned to a committee, you go to a committee and you sit there, the chair very oftentimes wants to make sure that everyone there has at least a knowledge of what is in that bill. So you should read the bill, and as you're listening to testimonies, you should be asking questions to the testifier that are pertinent to the bill itself. Oftentimes, and I know we have a great deal of leeway on this, but oftentimes people will get off on a tangent and talk about their issue or their likes that has very little to do with the bill, but maybe they're talking about the subject of it, but not much about what the bill. So questions are supposed to be oriented for clarification and better understanding on the bill or what the testifier means by talking either for or against the bill. And even after that is done, you have public hearings. Now you have another week or two goes by or three goes by, and now we have what we call executive session in the committee. That's when the committee votes on what to do with the bill. And all committee votes are recommendations to the House. They don't approve or disapprove. They form recommendations. You can recommend to pass the bill. You can recommend to fail the bill, which we call ITL. You can also recommend, it depends on if it's the first year, you can recommend interim study, which means that at some other point you have to meet again and discuss what you're going to do for the following year. But the point is that even after the executive session where everyone should be there to vote, the chair will assign people to write a short summary that goes into the calendar, and I think Wayne can show an example here. In the calendar, under every single bill, there is a short summary, which we call a committee report, that for the majority opinion and the minority opinion. And you're responsible to write that short report, and it has to be accurate because it's reviewed by the chair and then by the clerk and then by the Speaker of the House. And if they don't agree with what you said because it's not accurate or not pertinent, then they will ask you to rewrite it. So that's more work that you have to plan for when you're done on executive session. And then following that, the chair will assign, usually by volunteer, hopefully, who is going to talk on that bill, for or against. And now you have to go back and you have to prepare for your talk. And some people can talk very spontaneously. Other people have to write notes and write it out and figure out exactly what they're going to say. But the point that I'd like to make right now, and many people do not follow this, but really it does help. If you can present your speech in the well, which is when you get up in front of the entire House, keep it to about 3 minutes or under. In most cases, after 3 minutes, believe me, Wayne, correct me if I'm wrong, the House loses interest in what you're saying. Some people will get up and walk, some people will fiddle with their phones, or some people will start daydreaming. Most of the time, 3 minutes is well enough to make your point because most people have probably read the report, they've had caucus, they've discussed how they're going to vote on the bill. What you tell them is just an affirmation of why you're supporting or why you're against the bill.
There's an old expression, when you have a lot to say, you don't have to say a lot.
That's right. You know, how many times do we think people have snatched defeat from the jaws of victory by talking 10 or 15 minutes?
Exactly.
You know, people get antsy and they leave. It's an art, but it's something you should consider when you get up there and speak. Again, many people don't seem to have learned that. We know who they are.
And some of them are veteran members of the House, too.
That's right. That's right. So that's that process there for the House. And then, of course, you may do all this work, and let's say you work really hard and you get it through the House, and the House passes it. Sometimes the House passes it by a large margin. Sometimes maybe you have a 50 or 60 vote margin sometimes, and you say this is a piece of cake. It goes to the Senate, and what happens, Wayne? They ITL it.
No, they may, yes,
Why?
absolutely.
It's just something if you're a type A personality person, you have to understand that you may not get things done the first time you try. And many people leave after the first term because they can't get something done, so they just leave. If you become a representative, you're in it for the long haul in terms of at least 1 or 2 terms anyway. We know too many people have gone there for 1 year and they get frustrated and they just don't come back. So you have to know this going in, otherwise you could be surprised.
It's a very deliberate process, and again, you're dealing with 399 colleagues when you go into the House, and then when it goes to the House, from the House to the Senate, the whole concept of checks and balances, and the fact that currently one party is in charge of both chambers, but it's still a check and a balance, and because there's a, when one party is in control, whether it's the Democrats or the Republicans, and over the course of the last few decades, both parties have been in total control. That helps, but that doesn't eliminate the natural competition and the natural structural challenges between a House and the Senate and the governor's office, even if they're all of the same political party.
I'd like to turn away from the actual State House for a second and talk about county, because I think I've mentioned this before on the show. When you're elected as a representative, you are also a member of your county delegation, and you have responsibilities. And the county executive board, which is composed of representatives from within the county, and these are both Republicans and Democrats, you are assigned to be on a subcommittee, such as sheriff or facilities or the prison or the nursing home, the register of deeds, et cetera, et cetera. And usually there's about 5 people assigned to these subcommittees, and they meet maybe 2 or 3 times a year, and your purpose is to oversee the budget of the county. That's all your purpose is to oversee the county, make sure that the budget is in order, that you ask questions as to why they want to increase or why you're moving money. And it is your responsibility to show up at these subcommittee meetings, and each subcommittee has a chair, and the chair's responsibility is to hold these meetings and to write a report again afterwards that goes to the executive board. Now, you may not meet too often, but the delegation does meet, like I said, 3 or 4 times a year for the purpose of finally voting on the budget. The delegation, as a complete delegation, must vote on the budget to make sure that the county has an official budget approval, and that affects your town taxes as well. So there are responsibilities involved in that as well that most people are not aware of until they are assigned a subcommittee and they say, where'd this come from? You should know this up front, that you will have that responsibility as well. Anything else to add to that, Wayne? We have about a minute or so left.
Sure. Well, I have the privilege of chairing the subcommittee that deals with the commissioner's budget, the human resource budget, the treasurer's budget, general government, and grants. In fact, we just had our budget meeting with a number of those folks, and everything looks good. We have an excellent staff over in Brentwood that works with us and helps us in that regard. And again, as Doug said, we have the largest, second largest county in the state, and 95 million, I think, was our current budget, and that's going to go up a bit. We're going to actually have a meeting of the full Rockingham County delegation coming up May 22nd, I believe, and we'll be discussing salaries at that point. The full budget is underway, and fiscal year ends June 30th, so we have to have a new budget in place by then. As the state budget is biennial, so that's already set for until next year. But yeah, no, there's 15 subcommittees, I think.
I believe so, yes.
15 subcommittees. By the way, Doug doesn't give himself enough credit. He's the vice chairman of the executive committee, along with Representative Dave Mills from Derry, who's the chairman of the executive committee, and they're officers of the county, and then there's 15 of us chairman. And again, there's Democrats who are chairman as well.
Yes,
so
yes.
So it's a bipartisan effort. It's a very collegial atmosphere, and obviously I have some bias, but I think it's a very well-run county, and again, great staff to work with.
Right. Well, our time is just about over, so I hope you heard a little bit about some of what we do. It's not just go up there and vote and come back down again. There's a lot of effort that goes into it, and anyone that wants to run for office should be aware of their responsibilities. And I think I'd like to end with this observation. This is probably one of the few endeavors where it's a people business, and you have to learn how to deal with people, deal with your opposition. And I believe the old adage that you always get something better with honey than vinegar. It's a process of knowing how to talk to someone, how to get them to either agree with you or at least to be able to work with you anyway. And it's an art, and it's something that I think is very prevalent in our field, and I hope that's something for people to consider when they do run for office. Love to have you. That concludes our edition of Concord Conversations, and we will be here in a couple of weeks and talk about something else, and I hope you join us then. And until then, Londonderry, have a good day.
The preceding program was produced by Londonderry residents. The views and opinions expressed are not necessarily the views and opinions of the LACTV staff or its volunteers and should not be considered an endorsement by CTV 20 or its staff and volunteers.